Right. Belgium, utopia for our times. Une utopie pour onze têtes, une utopie pour notre temps. There won't be an English version of it, unlike some of my other books, because if you write for an international audience about this topic, you write a different sort of book. There are so many things that are taken for granted in the book that are familiar enough to Belgians, but that would need some more explanation for a general audience. Not for the sort of people in this room who are familiar enough, wherever they come from, with the Belgian situation, but for a broader audience. Utopia for our times. In fact, my book would not have that subtitle had it not been for extremely long, laborious negotiations between London and Brussels about access to the respective markets. I may say Brexit? No. Negotiations that took place in 1515, at the beginning of the 16th century, between the future Emperor Charles V, who had just become, aged 15, the sovereign of the Lower Countries, capital Brussels, and Henry VIII, who was a bit older, 27 I think at the time, who thought there was a good opportunity there to get a better deal for England in access to the markets in the Lower Countries. So he sent one of his hommes de confiance, the Sheriff of London, Thomas More, to negotiate with the emissaries of Charles V. But Charles V had to do his joyeuse entrée. He had to visit all the main cities in Flanders in order to go and meet the population. And so Thomas More was waiting in Bruges for something to happen. And so his friend Erasmus, who was in Leuven at the time, in Louvain at the time, said, why don't you go and see one of my friends, Peter Gillis, in Antwerp? And that's where he met this Portuguese guy who had come from a bizarre island called Utopia, and just as he was coming out of the church in Antwerp. And the story of the book, Utopia, is the story that was told by this chap to Thomas More on that day in Antwerp. So the word utopia explains my statement at the beginning. The word utopia was printed. Word utopia that is now used in all languages of the world, all living languages of the world. The word utopia was printed for the first time, not very far from here. It was printed in my alma mater in Leuven, because Erasmus was there, and he's the one who got this subversive little book, still very readable little book, published in Louvain in 1516. That's why my subtitle has something to do with laborious negotiations between London and Brussels. Now, what do I want to convey with this subtitle? Because utopia has a bit of a bad name. Indeed, in fact, this book was published also because a Flemish publisher, Polis, insisted that something that I should try to put together a number of things that I had written about the future of Belgium, and he had a very enthusiastic collaborator who quickly got translated the various pieces that I had published in French or in English. But I said, relax, because I had to finish my book on basic income that came out with Harvard University Press last year. And then I suddenly received a catalog for announcing my book, and it said Belgium, a utopia. And he thought the title was a bit long. So from a utopia for our times, it had become a utopia. Connotation is, of course, quite different. And a few weeks later, the collaborator was sacked by the publisher and went to join the online magazine of the Flemish Nationalist Party. That may have explained this delicate shortening of the word. So of the title. So what I want to convey with that is really that we need utopias, that are visions about the future that are not immediately implementable, that are politically not feasible now, but that are nevertheless desirable, sustainable, and therefore can provide us with an objective. And this is very important because this is what doesn't only give a direction to our present action, it also gives us the strength to move forward. The prologue in the French version of the book, the prologue of the book has a title, L'utopie fait la force. You know, the Belgian motto is L'union fait la force. Well, l'utopie fait la force, and I do believe that the only utopia on the table today that gives a lot of strength to the movement that supports it is the utopia of the dismantling of Belgium. That says, well, we have a vision about the future where Flanders and Wallonia can each have their own life that can be democratically more lively, more tension-free than is currently the case. This is a desirable future, and then this gives not only a direction, but gives us a strength to mobilize people with the hope of getting there. And in a way, what my book does is provide an alternative utopia, and a utopia for our times. And what I mean by that, and with reference also to the European situation, is that we'll have to learn, whether we like it or not, we'll have to learn to organize ourselves, to organize our democracies on a scale, at a level at which we have to operate with a very heterogeneous population, and in particular with populations that speak different languages. A utopia, Belgium is a utopia for our times because it must pave the way also and show the way also for other places in the world, for the European Union as a whole, and gradually for the institutions we need to build on the world scale. Belgium must help elaborate, however laboriously, the sort of institutions that are appropriate for that sort of context. I'll say that's we comment just on the subtitle of the book, but at the same time the general perspective in which it is written. I'll also say, of course, something about the title of it and why the title is English, but before I do so, and before I ask you another question, I would like to have some sense of the mother tongues that are the native languages that are present in the room. So who, just raise your hand, who in the room has English as his or her mother tongue? Those raise their hands. Okay. French. Okay. Dutch. Okay. There's Italian. Okay. Spanish. Okay. German. Okay. Another Latin language. Portuguese. Another Germanic language. Okay. A Slavic language. Okay. A non-European language. Okay. Very diverse. Excellent. But I'll turn to the specifically linguistic dimension, which is obviously of central importance for the specific challenge that is faced by Belgium. But before that, I'll ask you another question. And here you'll reply by voice, not by raising your hand. It's a technique which I learned in the period I was teaching at Harvard. I discovered that, and it's a more interactive way of consulting the audience. And the question is the following. You can just think about it for 10 seconds, and you are not committed to the answer for more than a few minutes afterwards, which is simply the question: do you think that by the end of this century, when we meet again in this room fully renovated, so do you think that by the end of this century, Belgium will still exist? Or do you think it will have fallen apart in two pieces, into two pieces, 3 pieces, 4 pieces, whatever. So, 10 seconds, okay. So those who think that Belgium as a political entity will still exist at the end of this century, those are going to say yes when I'll have said 1, 2, 3, okay? Those who think that Belgium will still exist at the end of this century, 1, 2, 3.
Yes!
Okay. You can, through the loudness of your voice, you can try to express the degree of your conviction, but okay. And who thinks that Belgium will have fallen apart by that? And so you will say again yes. 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Okay, a weak conviction. Okay, fine. I'll, given that there is still a significant majority in favor of the right answer to the question, so I'm here as a professor, so I'm supposed to know what the right answer is to the questions I ask myself, right? So I'll just, in fact, in the book, chapter 1 of the book is called Will Belgium Split? Zal België barsten? And I think it's worth going through the various possible scenarios. Right? The main scenarios are, that are discussed to some extent, that are advocated to some extent, are, at first you have two scenarios, simple scenario of falling into 2 pieces. You have Groot Vlaanderen, that is, Flanders absorbs Brussels and Wallonia remains alone. You have Nation francophone, that is, Wallonia absorbs Brussels and Flanders remains alone. Then you have these 2 scenarios, but with an absorption by the neighboring country. So one is Groot Nederland, where Wallonia leaves with Brussels and Flanders is absorbed by the Netherlands. You have rattachisme, that is, Flanders takes Brussels and Wallonia, left alone, is absorbed by France, okay? And then you have 2 scenarios in 3 pieces. One is called the condominium, where Flanders and Wallonia become fully independent, but they co-manage Brussels, okay? And finally, you have a scenario in which you say, well, there are 3 pieces, and Flanders, Wallonia, and then Brussels becomes an independent state, with some specific status because of its European status, okay? Now I'll ask, sorry?
You forgot the Germans.
The German part, well, I'm simplifying the thing. In the book I discuss that and the possibility of having 4 pieces, and for each of the 6 scenarios I discussed, you can have a separation of Germany, of what I call Oost-Belgian, or not. Okay. Now, I'll quickly consult you again and to get you thinking about this. So of these various scenarios, so I'll go through them again. For the people who said, yes, Belgium is going to split, I'm asking you which one is the most probable. And for the people who said, no, Belgium won't split, which one is the least improbable? Okay? Most probable or least improbable? And so I'll quickly repeat the 6 scenarios and then I'll go through them. One is Groot Vlaanderen, 2 pieces, and Flanders absorbs Brussels. Second, Nation francophone, 2 pieces, Wallonia takes Brussels. 3, Groot Nederland, Wallonia takes Brussels, and Flanders is absorbed by the Netherlands. Rattachisme, Flanders takes Brussels, Wallonia is absorbed by France. Condominium, Flanders, Wallonia independent, and they co-manage Brussels. And finally, you have the Brussels European capital or something like that, where Brussels is an independent entity. Okay? So let's quickly go through that. We have the voice again. I asked you for each of them, least improbable or most probable. So who thinks that of all these, the most probable, least improbable is the first one, that is Groot Vlaanderen. Those are going to say, you are going to say we, okay? We for us. We, unless you think that you are the only one in the room who is going to think so, then you can say I, okay? Right? So, First, whole Flanders, that is, Flanders absorbs Brussels. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Second scenario, nation francophone. So, Flanders alone, Wallonia absorbs Brussels. 1, 2, 3. Okay? It was, I don't know whether it was we for us or we for yes. Okay, then third scenario, Rood Nederland, so Flanders absorbed by the Netherlands. 1, 2, 3.
Oranje.
Oh, okay. Still a bit of an isolated positive response. Rattachisme. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Then we have condominium. 1, 2, 3. Ah. And finally, we have Brussels European capital or something, Brussels independent. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and the last two. Right. Sorry?
None of the above.
Okay. Then a quick word, then, because there is no point discussing the first four scenarios, and I'll quickly say why I don't believe either of the last two has any probability. Say a quick word. I developed that in the book. Fundamentally, condominium. Fundamental reason is that, as Bardewever said one day, well, we'll have the most difficult problem in the sort of dismantling of Belgium is, of course, the problem of Brussels. He says in this bruistablet, this sort of thing that is in the process of being dissolved in a glass of water, the only hard bit, and that's Belgium that is being dissolved, but there is a hard bit, and that is Brussels. And whether we want it or not, we'll have to, whatever solution is a solution which the Brusselaars moeten zien zitten, which the Brussels must be able to put up with. And will they be able to put up with a condominium? That is a formula in which it's not just that you are the colony of one little country, but you are the colony of two little countries that are going to quarrel all the time about what to do with the thing. There is only one thing about which they will agree easily, which is let all the planes fly over Brussels, right? So will the Brussels ever accept something like that? So surely they'll quickly realize that being dominated by one little country next to them will be bad enough, but being condominated by two, the condominium, that is not on. I say a few more things about that in the book. Yes?
I just want to comment that, I want to ask, what you say, the people from Brussels. I don't think that there's any stable definition for that, and that it might be different. The persona which you describe as the Brussels person, what they deal with, might change in over 10 years.
Yeah.
It's very,
Yes, you anticipate, let me say something about that, but you anticipate something that's important in my last chapter, which is a chapter about Brussels. And I'll quickly say that here, even though it destroys a bit the structure of what I'm going to say, but and so bracket this in because it's an important point, especially in Brussels. My last chapter has also two different titles in Dutch and in French. The French title refers to a quote by Jules d'Estrées, who was a big leader of the Walloon and socialist movement 1 century ago, who wrote a very interesting group without sort of any very candidly written, called La Querelle des Flamands et des Wallons, or something like that. And he says, he has something to say about Brussels. He was a Wallon from Charleroi. He says, les Bruxellois, c'est une population vraiment peu intéressante. Elle combine les défauts des deux races sans en avoir les qualités. It means the Brussels are really not interesting. They combine all the defects of the two races, meaning the Walloons and the Flemings, without having their qualities. And he said, le Bruxellois, ce n'est pas un peuple, c'est un agglomérat de métis. Un agglomérat de métis, an agglomerate of bastards, really. So the title of my last chapter, which is about Brussels, is Un peuple de métis. In the Dutch version, it's different, because there you had an interview, it refers to an interview with Jan Jan Bon, the current Deputy Prime Minister, before he became, he entered the government. He was interviewed in the newspaper De Morgen, and the journalist said, well, you are in favor of the autonomy of Flanders and the autonomy of Wallonia. What about Brussels? Yeah, he said, sorry, but Brussels, that's not a people. Dat is geen volk. That is not a people. Het is een versnippering van alles en nog wat, van alles en nog wat. It is a segmentation of tout et n'importe quoi, of anything. So essentially he was saying the same as Jules Destrée. And so my title became there, een volk van alles en nog wat. So a people of everything. And the fundamental point here, to reply to your question, is that undeniably, they are right. It is an agglomérat de métis. It is a verstippering van alles en nog wat. Witness the people in the room, right? We are, the diversity of the people, most of you no doubt live in Brussels, and it is really, and that means it makes it's a challenge to turn that agglomérat, this versnippering, into something like a people. Not in the sense of an ethnos, of a nation with a common culture, etc., but as a population that is able to form a common will. And part of the challenge, and I try to explain in chapter 6 how we can do that in Brussels, is to do that because it's essential, not simply in order to have a better state structure more globally, but also for the good of the people in Brussels, and through that also for the people in the whole of the country, and because of Brussels' role as the European capital, also with an impact far beyond that. And I try and make a number of proposals that go in that direction, that are partly also resting on trends that exist, and there has been a significant strengthening of the Brussels identity among people wherever they come from in the last 20 years, 10 years, certainly. So that's essentially, but I think it's a very important point. So I go back to where I was, which is, how many minutes do I have left?
10.
10, okay. I go back to where I left, which was then, what about the last scenario? And the scenario number 6, which was regarded as the least improbable, or most probable by a number of you. Well, it's again related to the point that was just made, because you have to think then about how you can make that population function as an independent country. Problem is, of course, not that there are too few inhabitants, 1,200,000. I mean, that's significantly more than Luxembourg or Malta. So that's not the problem. It's hardly not that different from Estonia or smaller Baltic countries, so that's not really, or Slovenia, that's not the problem. It's not the problem either of the wealth on that territory. So Brussels is, with a population that's about 10% of Belgium, it's 19% of the GDP in Belgium, so GDP per capita in Brussels, so the wealth created in Brussels relative to the population in Brussels is very high, about 3 times higher than GDP per capita in Flanders, so that's not a problem. But of course, the problem is that Brussels is extremely tiny. And because it's so tiny, it's only the large central quarter of a much bigger agglomeration. And one consequence of that is that you have an extremely mobile population. 13% of the Brussels population either moves in to Brussels or moves out of Brussels every year. Every year. So with that sort of population, how can you organize a pension system? How can you organize a stable tax and transfer system covering all the, how it is, of course, this movement is a challenge for the creation of a Brussels people, but it means that you have to downsize your ambition about how people like this people is going to be. but it is a sort of prohibitive challenge if you, in terms of organizing tax and transfer system at that level. So that is something that you can't do it. You can't do it. You can't have that for a neighborhood, even a large neighborhood within a much bigger city. That is just unfeasible. It would lead to all sorts. And so that's the main argument. I have other arguments explaining why this is not going to happen. Okay, so that is just a selective answer then to the question or argumentation behind my answer to the question of my first chapter, which is, will Belgium ever split? I'll just, within my remaining minutes, I'll just then go back, as promised, to the choice of the title itself, which is Belgium. There is a very famous quote in the history of political philosophy, famous passage in one of the first treatises on democracy, namely Considerations on Representative Government by John Stuart Mill, 1861, where he speaks about the Walloons and the Flemings as an exception to a possible exception to his general rule. And his general rule is the following, and it's a very grim prediction for all the countries that are multilingual. He says free institutions, and by that he means democratic institutions, are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities, among a people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages. The united public opinion necessary to the working of representative government cannot exist. The influences which form opinions and decide political acts are different in the different sections of the country. An altogether different set of leaders have the confidence of one part of the country and of another, etc. His prediction is that whereas despotic regimes can survive for centuries in multilingual entities, many empires did that, once you introduce democracy, you will tend to have a coincidence between the linguistic borders and the political borders. You give the power to the people, means they speak, you hear their voices, and then they discover they speak different languages. And then you have what today has been presented as the key problem for Belgium today by Wever and by many following him, which is that Belgium, that's not one democracy, it's two democracies. And therefore it can't last. That is, in fact, an application to Belgium of this claim that was made and illustrated, that was made by John Stuart Mill and illustrated by the collapse of the Austrian Empire, by the collapse of the Soviet Union, by the collapse of Yugoslavia, and you have many, many examples throughout the world. And so the question is, what should we do about it? Can one do something about it?
Sorry, what did he say about Belgium? He said
I don't have the quote here. What he says in the passage just before, he said, well, there are some exceptions, like the people in Switzerland, and he said the Walloons and the Flemings in Belgium have more in common than the Flemings have with the Dutch and the French, and the Walloons with the French. But this is 1861. That is, at a time when you can't speak about democracy in Belgium. We had only the rich could vote, and Belgium was at the time, exactly like France, officially a unilingual French country. It's only at the end of the century that Dutch, Flemish as it was called at the time, was recognized as a second official language. So, but what was attempted to address this question is precisely to try to make Belgium a unilingual country. The proportion of people who had French as a native language in 1830, when Belgium became independent, was about the same as the proportion of those who spoke French as a native language in the current territory of France at the time of the Revolution. But the Frenchization of France, top down, went through. The attempt to do the same in Belgium failed. My own view is that it failed for good reasons. and that is, it is right that it should have failed, because the failure is due to the equal respect that was paid to the two main languages spoken by the people. But the result gradually, so I go through the various versions of that, the attempts to make Belgium bilingual. Jules Destrée, who I quoted before, making everyone bilingual, called that une solution imbécile qui n'a pu être concoctée que par des Bruxellois. So that was, as you can see, he was not that keen on the mishmash of the, and so I go through all that. And the question is, well, today it is true that we have two public opinions, that the Francophones don't read the Flemish press, so, and the converse is no longer true. There was a time when a newspaper, up to the 1960s, a newspaper like La Libre Belgique had half of its readers in Flanders. So all this has disappeared. You have people don't watch each other's medias, etc. You have the two public opinions, the two democracies. What can you do about it? And here comes, so I won't have time to explain. I have 4 more minutes, something like that.
4, go on then, 4.
4 more minutes, and there comes my title, because I say, well, you know, something has happened since Belgium independence, since the Flemish, so-called Flemish question came up. Indeed, even since Belgium became a federal state in 1994, and that is that now the second language in each of the 3 regions of the country is no longer the second national language. It is English. Not only that, but in addition to that, when you look, with the latest data we have, in fact, English for the younger generation has caught up with Dutch. There are more young people able to communicate in English in Belgium than in Dutch, and it is in the process of catching up with French. Dutch is the most widely spread language as a native language, but as a known language, French is the first language in Belgium on aggregate. But for the younger generation, English has overtaken Dutch, and it is in the process of catching up with French. So what I'm saying is that, and I try to explain that in this chapter 3 of the book, and is that this is going to have a gradually important impact on the way in which something like a Belgian people functions. And there will be more and more situations, there are already quite a few, where the language used by Belgians who don't have the same mother tongue will be English. Indeed, and that will be my punchline, my book couldn't have come out at a better time. It came out at the end of June, and I could, on the book launch, I came with a tin of beer with the name Belgium, right? The title of my book. There was all this advertising for my book all over the place, because it was Belgium all over. And the trainer Martinez of the Belgian national team explained in an interview recently how important the use of English in all internal communication at the training sessions had been, even for the cohesion of the team. He said there are many circumstances in life in which you are not neutral and must not be neutral, but the ability to use and the possibility of using a neutral language among these people proved to be important for the cohesion of the group. Because that will be my final word, because English does not only have the advantage that in many circumstances it provides the least laborious way of talking to each other in the younger generation, not in the older generation. And there's a utopia, is a vision for the future. But in addition, through a miracle of the linguistic history of the world, the language that has proven to become, that has turned out to become the lingua franca of Europe, and indeed of the world, it's just a mishmash of Dutch and French. So there are still people complaining. So thank you for your attention.